Then Mary conceived Jesus and withdrew with him to a remote place. And the throes of childbirth drove her to the trunk of a palm tree. And she said, "Oh, that I had died before this, and had been a thing quite forgotten." So a voice came to her from beneath her, "Grieve not. Surely the Lord has provided a stream beneath thee. And shake towards thee the trunk of the palm tree. It will drop on thee ripe dates. So eat and drink and cool the eye." This is a story from the Quran. Quran meaning recitation or lecture, because in Islam, the Quran are the writings of the Prophet Muhammad, who was listening to the angel Gabriel, who dictated to Muhammad what God wanted Muhammad to hear and to share with the people. We're told it took 23 years, beginning when Muhammad was 40 and concluding in the year of his death, and that Muslims look at this as a miracle, that God would speak directly to Muhammad and he would write down, and the others around him would write down the story. You've noticed that we have some renovations, some refreshing and revisioning of our gathering space happening. And all of our books have been removed because the bookshelves are gone, and some new bookshelves have arrived, and they're yet to be put all the way together. And so you might have noticed that there's only one book out there by the couches and chairs, and it's actually the Quran, because on Thursday night we hosted a Sacred Objects of Multiple Faiths event put on by the Interfaith Partnership of Greater St. Louis. And Ghazala Hyatt, some of you know Ghazala. She is a Muslim woman who is a doctor at SLU. She works in neurology and neuromuscular medicine and neuropsychiatry. She works with the SLU ALS clinic, so she knows some of our church members very well, unfortunately. Ghazala was presenting from the Muslim perspective, and she left us a copy of the Quran. So probably there aren't a lot of churches in the area that have one book out in their library area, and it is the Quran. So Dr. Hyatt, if you look her up on SLU's physician website, it says that she's an active advocate. Those are the best kinds of advocates, by the way, active advocate for interfaith partnerships. She serves on boards from the Pakistani American Association of St. Louis and American Voices. She's a member of the Islamic Foundation of Greater St. Louis on Weidman Road, and she serves on the board of Interfaith Partnership of St. Louis. And so now I want to share another story with you that comes from a sacred writing in Christianity. It comes from the Gospel of Pseudo-Matthew, not the Gospel of Matthew that we know from our scriptures, but this is from the apocrypha. And you remember the apocrypha are other scriptures that were written that came later when the Bible was canonized and kind of locked in, when the books of the Bible were formalized and locked in, and there were some other writings that were found and can continue to teach us and lead us and encourage us and deepen our own faith. And so this Gospel of Pseudo-Matthew has a similar story. It's a little bit different because in this account, Jesus is already born, not like the story from the Quran where Mary is pregnant and in the throes of childbirth and is exhausted and leans against that tree. But this time, Jesus is already a baby, and they're on their flight to Egypt. They know that they cannot stay because of the threats of the government and the threats of the power that want to annihilate them, and so they leave to go to Egypt to find a safe place. Immigrants, refugees, always looking for a safe place, a place of welcome and a place of warmth where they can rest a little bit and then figure out the rest of their story later. So it says, "And it came to pass on the third day of their journey, while they were walking, that the Blessed Mary was fatigued by the excessive heat of the sun in the desert. And seeing a palm tree, she said to Joseph, 'Let me rest a little under the shade of this tree.' Joseph therefore made haste and led her to the palm tree and made her come down from the beast she was riding. And as the Blessed Mary was sitting there, she looked up to the foliage of the palm tree and saw it full of fruit and said to Joseph, "I wish it were possible to get some of the fruit of this palm." And Joseph said to her, "I wonder what thou sayest, when thou seest how high the palm tree is, and that thou thinkest of eating its fruit." I'm thinking more of the want of water, because the skins are now empty and we have none wherewith to refresh ourselves and our cattle. Then the child Jesus, with a joyful countenance, reposing in the bosom of his mother, said to the palm tree, "O tree, bend thy branches and refresh my mother with thy fruit." And immediately at those words, the palm bent its top down to the very feet of the Blessed Mary, and they gathered from it fruit. It remained bent down, waiting the order to rise from him who had commanded it to stoop. Then Jesus said to it, "Raise thyself, O palm tree, and be strong, and the companion of my trees which are in the paradise of God. And open from your roots a vein of water which has been hid in the earth, and let the waters flow, so that we may be satisfied from thee." And the palm rose up immediately, and its roots there began to forth a spring of water, exceedingly clear and cool and sparkling. And when they saw the springs of water, they rejoiced with great joy and were satisfied, themselves and all their cattle and all their beasts. Wherefore they gave thanks to God. Some stories from the past, some stories about Mary and Jesus and Joseph that maybe you have heard or maybe you have not heard, but it helps us to think a little differently about the story and about our past as we hear a new reflection on it from a new angle, from a new source, whether that is from another faith tradition or from our own tradition that didn't quite get canonized in the scriptures the way that we lean on them. Some of you maybe have Bibles that have apocryphas between the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament and New Testament, and maybe you're familiar with this story and some others. But today, we heard from the book of Hebrews in the New Testament, and it laid out some more of the history, and it named some names and talked about some circumstances and situations from the past to try to refresh us and remind us of our own story, because sometimes we forget our own story. Sometimes we're so focused on the moment and the future that we forget where we've been, the things that we have learned, the opportunities that we have had to mature and to become more faithful, more present in the moment, and more present to one another. And so this piece from the book of Hebrews tells us about things that might disturb us, might delight us, some stories that might encourage us or inspire us or horrify us, because we all have pasts, and collectively we have a past that was pleasant and kind and generous and hospitable, and we all have stories too that are demeaning and distorted and don't help us to rise and strive for the things that we know that are of God. You might see in the bulletin later a story about the Milwaukee Art Museum, where a couple had been walking through the museum and they moved from room to room, and one of them began to quietly hum a little tune. And her partner asked about that tune, and she said that it's from one of the rooms before us, the song that was playing in the background. And he said, "No, the song that we heard a couple rooms back sounded more like this." And so, of course, they went back to that room and they found out that both of those tunes were layered in that room, so they were both right. They just remembered a different part of the story. They just keyed into different ways of understanding what was happening at the moment. It's like our faith stories. It's like our history of a people. Some of us grab onto certain things, and some of us let other things go. Some of us look at something that happened in a chapter of our own lives, the lives of our family, the life of our community or our country or the world, and it seems pivotal to us. It seems like the one we want to work on, the one we want to revisit, the one that we want to guide us or correct us or challenge us or delight us. And so we took a little tour, a little field trip to our history tower to see just a little bit, to just have a little taste of some of the things that are part of our story. And you maybe have been here your whole life, some of you. Maybe some of you have not been here very long at all. Maybe this is your first day here. And so our sense of history is different. Our sense of knowing this church's story is different. And so we might have very different recollections, hold on to different things, and be encouraged and enlivened by different things. As I think about the churches, the many churches I've been involved in my lifetime, I think about specific things that rise when I remember them. And probably it would be robust conversation to sit around with other people and say, what are the things that come to mind most for you about this faith community or about this group of people? And so the church that I grew up in, Quincy Point Congregational Church, United Church of Christ in Quincy, Massachusetts, one of the things that I think about most is that they moved 7 blocks up the road in the 40s. They took down the wires, they widened the road a little bit because they wanted, for some reason, to have the church move 7 blocks. And so that speaks to me about the church on the move, right? It encourages me to think that the church is not just a building, and that the church has to move, and the church has to not get stuck, and the church has to be willing to do things that it never had dreamed that it would do before. I think about a church that I served in Kansas City, where the organist who retired had had a major heart episode and had surgery. He lived alone and didn't have insurance at the time, and so a number of people volunteered to stay with him overnight to get him through the first week. He said after 5 days that he didn't need the last 2 days of that week. But he said, I don't want to block a blessing because people signed up for this and people wanted to be caring and kind. They wanted to build the kind of community that we all need. He said, so don't tell them that I don't need them, because I learned a long time ago that blocking a blessing is not a good thing. So don't block a blessing. As we think about our own stories and the places that we've been, the communities that we're in, maybe the families that we're in, certain stories seem to repeat themselves. They may be the ones that we hold on to, or they may be the ones that we just assume put aside. There might be other things that speak directly to us. And so you heard in the Hebrew reading this morning this reflection, this kind of family reunion conversation, where it was said something about the Red Sea, and it talked about Jericho's wall, and it talked about Rahab and the spies, and then it mentioned Barak and Samson and Jephthah and David and Samuel, and it remembered some women who received back those who were resurrected. And the author said, I would run out of time if I told you about these characters. They conquered kingdoms. They brought about justice. They realized promises. They shut the mouths of lions. They put out raging fires, escaped from the edge of the sword, found strength in weakness, were mighty in war, and routed foreign armies. Others were tortured and refused to be released. Others experienced public shame, and on, telling the story of the people, kind of catching them up with where they've been, and then encouraging them to move ahead. What I don't like about this list of characters and stories is that it brings up armies and violent leaders and battles and conquests, which is part of our story. It's part of our history that we have to deal with. We can't deny certain pieces of our history just because we don't like them. We can't ignore them or decide that didn't really happen, that piece of our history that I don't like. But we can call up other stories too, to put them alongside the ones that make us uncomfortable, the ones that cause us to cringe, the ones that help us to see the humanity and the limitations that we have. What if this list for you and for me had Shiphrah and Puah, the midwives, who were mighty and strong and sturdy when they were helping those women birth those Hebrew babies? And what about Miriam, Moses' sister, and Pharaoh's daughter, who went and drew Moses out of the water so that she would raise him as her own? And what about Ruth and Naomi promising to belong to each other when they said, your people will be my people, where you lodge, I will lodge, where you go, I will go? And what about Esther, who didn't really want to be involved, but she realized that she was in the place that she was in the moment that she was in, so that she could use her power and her voice and her influence, even though she didn't want to. She said, for such a time as this, and she acted. And then there are the 5 sisters that maybe you know about, Mela and Noah and Hogla and Milcah and Tirzah. They were the daughters of Zelophehad. He had died and did not have any sons. And so his land, what would happen to it? Because he only had daughters. And so these 4 sisters spoke directly to Moses and to the priests and said, please tell God that we want the inheritance. We don't want our father's name to die. We don't want our family to completely crumble. We want to have a future. We believe that God wants us to have a future. And so these sisters spoke to Moses. Moses spoke to God, and the whole culture shifted, so that these 5 sisters were able to take their father's legacy. And so there are stories, constant stories that come to us from our past, from our collective story, from our unique stories like in a history tower, and we remember them. Maybe we relive them. Maybe we try to live them down. Maybe we try to edit them. Maybe we try to escape them. Maybe we try to live in spite of them. And there are other stories that feed us and inspire us and encourage us and help us to move forward, that remind us of the things that are of God, the things that are meant to move us ever more forward into places of freedom and justice, into places where we can serve each other and continue to learn and be committed to conversation and compassion, being flexible and faithful. And so Psalm 80 was also given to us today. Carrie read it, and it talks about another tree that has deep roots and an abundance of branches and therefore lots of shade. And it talks in there about revising and restoring, and I add the idea of restoration and refreshment and renewal, that we can look back and we can stand firmly rooted in the moment. We can learn from our past. We can shake off some of the things that we wish had not happened without ignoring them or pretending that those are not our stories. But we can focus our energies and our attention on the things that will build up, so that when someone else looks back at this moment, when someone else is remembering this time and this place, they can see inspiration and encouragement. They don't have to cringe. They don't have to imagine, why weren't they faithful? Why didn't they understand what it was that God was asking of them? Every once in a while I give a plug for this, United Church of Christ Firsts. So there are several copies on the literature rack when you first come in the door, and it talks a little bit about our United Church of Christ history and little snippets about some of the things that we were engaged in and involved in that helped us to rise, that helped us to be faithful, that helped us to listen to the call of God, that helped us to be creative and steady, and helped us to be committed to the common good. And so those stories, mixed with lots of other stories, can encourage us, can ground us, can set us free and set us on a path that the Holy wants us and needs us to be on. Please pray with us. God, we do have a story. We do have a history as individuals and as families, as a community, as a country, as a world. And we know the dark side of the stories, and we don't want to forget them or ignore them, but we want to set them aside so that we can focus on the things of the future, the things of weaving all of your people together, the things of feeding and clothing and visiting and welcoming and loving each other, that we need a paradigm shift. And so help us to be faithful, to be creative, to be compassionate, so that in this moment we can rise to the occasion for such a time as this. And so that when others in the future look back, they can see that we were listening, that we were making room for you, that we were not self-absorbed, that we were committed to community. God, help us to move forward in faith and to move forward in love. Amen.